Hello, welcome to the Address of Fear. If you love horror stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. If you're ready, let's get started. Jessica woke up with a sudden jolt. As her eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness, she noticed an eerie silence filling the room. It was as if the whole world had held its breath, waiting for something to happen. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. Her throat was dry. She got up from her bed with heavy steps to get a sip of water. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath her feet. As she stepped into the hallway, she realized that the house was colder than usual. She was only wearing a thin t-shirt, but this wasn't just a normal nighttime chill. It was a coldness that seeped under her skin, sinking deep into her bones. As she walked towards the bathroom, her eyes flicked to the clock. 3:07. A strange unease crept over her. She didn't like waking up at this hour. Moving on tiptoe, she reached the bathroom. Without turning on the light, she slipped inside and turned on the faucet. She let the cold water fill her palms before splashing it onto her face. And then, something moved. She saw it from the corner of her eye, like a shadow slipping between the dark walls. Her breath caught in her throat as she snapped her head up to look at the mirror. In the corner of the wall, a dark, human-like shadow shifted. But this was no ordinary shadow. It was alive. It trembled, shifted, changing shape right before her eyes. Jessica froze. She searched for a logical explanation. Was it just her imagination? A trick of the light? But then, the shadows moved. Again, faster, more distinctly. It was as if someone, was stirring inside the bathroom. But there was no one there. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She took a step back. Her hands felt like ice. Taking a deep breath, she summoned all her courage and flipped the light switch. The moment the light flickered on, everything looked normal. The bathroom was empty. The walls, the mirror, the toothbrush resting on the sink, everything was in its place. But the feeling inside Jessica, that didn't go away. She tried to convince herself. I was just sleepy. My eyes played tricks on me. There's no other explanation, but deep down she knew something was wrong, and this was only the beginning. The next night, as Jessica woke up, a familiar sense of unease settled over her. She thought about the shadows she had seen the night before. She didn't know if they were real, but deep in her mind, she struggled to come up with logical explanations. She got out of bed, shivering in her thin pajamas as she walked through the hallway. The house felt colder than ever. When she reached the bathroom, she hesitated. The door was closed, but from inside, she could hear something, an almost imperceptible sound like a faint rustling. Her heartbeat quickened. Maybe it's just the wind. Taking a deep breath, she reached for the handle and pushed the door open. The bathroom was empty, but the air inside felt heavier, denser, as if an invisible presence filled every corner. She stepped inside, shivering, as the cold wrapped around her. Without thinking further, she leaned over the sink, splashing cold water on her face in an attempt to steady herself. But then, something moved in the mirror. Jessica slowly lifted her head. Her heart leapt to her throat. In the reflection, standing right behind her, was a pitch-black silhouette. This time she knew her eyes weren't deceiving her. Because the figure moved, it tilted its head ever so slightly, as if letting her know it was watching. Jessica screamed, stumbling backward, her back slamming against the wall. Her breath hitched, her eyes wide with terror as she stared at the mirror. But when she turned around, there was nothing. It was only visible in the mirror. She placed her trembling hands on the edge of the sink. She was searching for a rational explanation. Light reflections? An illusion? But then she realized the shadow had eyes, and it was smiling. Jessica bolted out of the bathroom, sprinting back to her room. She grabbed her phone and, despite her shaking hands, opened the video recording app before cautiously returning to the bathroom. This time, she was more careful. She watched herself on the phone screen as she entered the bathroom and looked into the mirror. At first, there was nothing. The room looked completely normal. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, and then the image on the screen flickered, and the shadow appeared. But this time it was closer. Jessica focused on the screen, her heart pounding wildly. Something was standing behind her, but when she turned around, there was still no one there. Her phone's camera started shaking. The shadow in the mirror was moving again, but now, its movements were much faster. Jessica's breathing grew unsteady. The shadow was slowly advancing toward her, and then, something whispered. The voice was high-pitched, hoarse, and deeply unsettling. Jessica screamed, dropping her phone. The screen hit the floor, tilting upward towards the ceiling with a distorted, flickering image. But even then, there was still something on the screen. The shadow was still watching her, and just before the phone screen went black, something appeared in the lower left corner. It made Jessica's blood run cold. The pitch-black silhouette's face was now fully visible, and it seemed to be saying a single word: "You found me." Jessica's sleepless nights had become routine. She knew something was wrong in her house, but she kept trying to convince herself with logical explanations. She was tired, exhausted. Maybe it was just stress, hallucinations caused by fatigue. But now, it wasn't just in the bathroom. She could feel it everywhere. While watching TV in the living room, making coffee in the kitchen, lying in bed. That same eerie feeling, shadows vanishing at the edge of her vision, strange shapes appearing on the walls, and sometimes, just for a split second, a pair of eyes. Every time she turned to look, there was nothing, but she knew. The feeling was real. The first whispers came that night. It was 3:07 a.m. Jessica woke up suddenly. The room was filled with a heavy silence. It was so intense that it felt as if the entire world had come to a standstill. And then, she heard it. Whispers. At first, they were distant, like the rustling of the wind, but then slowly, they became clearer. Someone was speaking. She couldn't make out the words, but the voice. It wasn't just one, multiple voices whispering at the same time, trapped within the walls, murmuring in unison. Jessica swallowed hard, pulling the blanket up to her face. Her heart pounded wildly. The sound was coming from the bathroom. She held her breath. She had never felt terror like this before. But if there was truly something in that bathroom, she had to find out. With trembling hands, she slipped out of bed. Her steps were silent, but with each movement, the wooden floor beneath the carpet let out a faint creak. She reached the door, hesitated for just a moment, then stepped into the hallway. As Jessica approached the bathroom, the whispers grew clearer, and just as she reached the door, they stopped. Now the voices were completely understandable. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. They were saying her name, a slow, hoarse, echoing voice. Jessica, At that moment, she wanted to run, but she couldn't. Something was watching her. She clenched her fists, trying to steady herself. She had to open the door. Taking a deep breath, she slowly pushed it open. The bathroom was pitch black, but something was inside. She could feel it. She reached for the light switch, but just as her fingers brushed the switch, a freezing breath touched the back of her neck. Every hair on her body stood on end. Her entire body froze. Jessica knew something was standing behind her. She didn't want to turn. But her body betrayed her. Slowly, almost against her will, she turned her head, and the shadows were moving. Across the hallway walls and the corners of the ceiling, faint, shifting, bodiless figures. But one of them was staring at her. Jessica let out a scream and threw herself into the bathroom, slamming the door shut. Her breaths came in sharp gasps, her fingers ice cold. But then, she realized, the whispers were inside the bathroom, and in the mirror, a pitch-black silhouette stood right behind her. Jessica's sense of time was fading. The days blurred together. She was exhausted. Her eyes were sunken, her body drained. Was she even sleeping? Or just closing her eyes, pretending? She didn't know. She couldn't remember what had happened the night before. All she knew was that when she woke up that morning, her lungs ached. Breathing was difficult. Her throat was dry, like someone had been gripping it all night. She climbed out of bed and went to the mirror, and her blood ran cold. There was a bruise on her neck, dark, finger-shaped marks, as if someone had tried to strangle her. But when? Jessica couldn't remember. She stared at her reflection for a few seconds, an unspeakable fear tightening around her chest. If someone had done this to her, wouldn't she have woken up? Wouldn't she have screamed? Wouldn't she remember? But there was nothing. Trying to shake off the fear, she forced herself to go to the cafe where she worked. Even the warmth of the familiar space couldn't bring her comfort. Her coworkers noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the pale, hollow look on her face. "You okay, Jess? You look exhausted." Jessica forced a smile. "I didn't sleep well last night." The truth was, she couldn't remember the last time she had slept at all. But the worst part were the bruises. How could she explain them? She couldn't have done this to herself in her sleep. Something happened last night. Something was in her room. And now, she had to find out what. When Jessica returned home, she decided to check the apartment's security cameras. There was a camera right in front of her door. Maybe it could help her understand what had happened that night. Taking a deep breath, she started the recording. Param. Jessica's bedroom door was opening. Her breath hitched as she saw herself on the screen. She was there, but she didn't remember this. On the footage, Jessica was getting out of bed, but her movements were strange, almost as if she were sleepwalking. Her head was tilted slightly forward, her steps slow and unsteady. She walked down the hallway, stopped in front of the bathroom door, but she didn't turn on the light. Jessica's eyes were locked on the screen. She was watching her own body, but it didn't feel like watching herself. For minutes, she just stood there, motionless, as if she was waiting, as if she wanted something inside to call out to her. And then, she opened the door and stepped inside. The door closed behind her. Time passed. Jessica never came out until 7:48 a.m., but she didn't remember being in the bathroom at all. The only thing she remembered was going to bed. Jessica stared blankly at the screen. Then she noticed something. Just before the door closed, something reflected in the mirror. The camera's angle wasn't fully focused inside, but for a brief moment, in the mirror. There was another silhouette, standing right next to her. Jessica's mind was in turmoil. She found no peace, neither in the night nor in the day. She knew she wasn't alone anymore. But what was this thing? The whispers, the shadows, the constant feeling of being watched. Where were they coming from? She had stopped fighting with her own mind. She wasn't looking for logical explanations anymore. Because she had stepped beyond the limits of logic. She needed help. Finding someone who investigated paranormal events wasn't difficult. She was desperate to find an explanation for the nightmare she had been living in. His name was Daniel Hayes, a well-known paranormal investigator on YouTube. When Jessica reached out to him and told him what was happening, he didn't hesitate. But the moment he stepped inside, his face turned pale. Jessica watched him carefully. Daniel froze for a few seconds before stepping further in. His eyes scanned the room, as if he were searching for something invisible. Then, he whispered, "Something is here." A shiver ran down Jessica's spine. Daniel's gaze was fixed on the bathroom. "And it wants you." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't ready to hear that. But deep down, she had felt it for a long time. Daniel pulled out his equipment, muttering to himself as he jotted down a few notes. He scanned the rooms with an EMF detector, but the place that caught his attention the most was the bathroom. "This is the focal point," he said. "Everything starts here." Jessica already knew that. Daniel then reached into his small bag and pulled out a handful of flour and scattered it across the floor. Jessica asked in shock, "What's this supposed to do?" Daniel kept his eyes on her as he replied, "If something is here, it will leave a trace when it moves." Jessica's stomach churned. She didn't want something to leave a trace, but at the same time, she was tired of thinking she was going insane. She needed answers. They turned off the lights. Silence filled the bathroom. Jessica's breathing was uneven. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Daniel focused on his devices while Jessica kept her eyes locked on the darkness, trying to catch even the slightest movement from the bathroom. Then, tap. Both of them turned their heads at the same time. A noise had come from inside the bathroom. Jessica held her breath. And then, it happened again. Tap, 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 as if someone was walking inside. But even when Jessica stopped breathing, the footsteps continued. There was someone in there. Daniel quickly reached for the light switch and flicked it on. The bathroom lit up instantly. Jessica squinted, trembling as she looked at the floor. And what she saw was the most horrifying moment of her life. There were human footprints in the flour, but the footprints started on the wall. They slowly descended onto the floor, and then continued as if someone had been walking inside. Jessica let out a scream and stumbled backward. But the worst part was Daniel's face. His expression was frozen in shock, because the footprints were huge, and after only 2 steps, they vanished, as if whatever had been standing there had disappeared into thin air. Jessica's hands shook as she hastily grabbed her bag. She couldn't stay in this house for another second. Her knees were still weak. Her stomach was twisted in nausea. Ever since she had seen those footprints in the bathroom, even breathing had felt difficult. This couldn't be her home anymore. She wasn't alone here. That night, she checked into a hotel. Her heartbeat never slowed. Her mind kept replaying the same images over and over. The footprints, starting from the wall, the silhouette in the mirror, just before the bathroom door shut. And Daniel's words, "Something is here, and it wants you." Jessica sat at the edge of the bed, pulling her knees to her chest. She clutched her phone tightly. Was it over? Had she really escaped? Could she leave all of this behind? The answer came the next morning. Jessica had woken up hoping to start a new life, but then a notification on her phone shattered that hope. Security camera, motion detected. Jessica's blood ran cold. The house was empty. With trembling hands, Jessica gathered all her courage and played the video. The footage was dark. The camera by the door had recorded with a slight tremor. At first, she saw nothing. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows. Jessica's heart nearly stopped. A face, but not a human face. Hollow eye sockets, a twisted mouth. And the moment Jessica watched it, the figure slowly leaned toward the door. Then, it slammed against it. Jessica dropped her phone, but the sound that echoed in her ears wasn't the slam. It was the whisper at the end of the video. "It's not over." Jessica never went back to that house, but even after moving somewhere new, the night stayed the same. Every single night, at exactly 3:07 a.m., she woke up, and sometimes, when she opened her eyes in the darkness, she could swear she saw a shadow in the mirror.